Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program here at Beit Avichai, launching Dr. Aviva Zornberg's latest book, The Hidden Order of Intimacy, Reflections on the Book of Leviticus, with Dr. Aviva Zornberg joined in conversation with author Ilana Kurshan. For those of us that have had the pleasure and the honor of studying with Dr. Zornberg at Beit Avichai for the last years, you'll know what kind of insightful, gripping process it is to study with Dr. Zornberg as she takes us through the words of the Psukim and the pages of the Torah into the depth of greater understanding. We are so excited by the conversation that's about to take place and about the launch of this, what unquestionably will be an exciting new book by Dr. Zornberg. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Aviva, it's such an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. I want to open with a text from the Gemara in Horayot. It's the advice that one rabbi gives to his son about the proper way to study Torah. Rav Misharshia said to his son, "When you enter and study before your teacher, study the material first and only then enter to learn before your teacher. And when you are sitting before your teacher, look at your teacher's mouth, as it is written, and your eyes shall behold your teacher. V'hayu einecha ro'ot et morecha." From Yeshayahu. And when you study adjacent to a river of water. Just as the water flows, so too your studies shall flow unimpeded. Aviva, I've been fortunate to learn with you for many years. First through your books, then from your classes, and then from the notes I took over the course of many years of sitting in on your classes. I remember people used to ask me, why do you attend Aviva's class week after week and year after year? And I would say, because when I sit in on Aviva's classes, something begins to flow within me. She unleashes something in me. And when I hear her teach, I feel like I am overflowing with Torah, like her Torah is running through me, like water. Now, this privilege of learning directly from a teacher has been lost to many of us during the pandemic. We don't get to see our teachers face to face without the mediation of a screen. We don't have that experience of that electric current flowing from teacher to student, galvanizing and inspiring the student. Now, this question of how we negotiate these periods of absence, these periods of lack of presence, is central to a subject you've written about on several occasions, and it lies at the heart of your new book as well. I'm thinking about how you've written about the Fort Da game, a famous anecdote in which Freud observes a disturbing habit in his infant grandson. His grandson used to take a spool, a wooden reel with a piece of string, and he would spool it and unspool it over the edge of his crib, throwing it and then drawing it back so that it disappeared, alternating between saying fort, meaning gone, and da, there, when it came back. Freud commented that the child was staging the disappearance and reappearance of his mother. The game recalls a midrash about the Israelites in Egypt who used to cope with their oppression and with God's seeming absence by playing a game every Shabbat, the midrash says, in which they would take out scrolls, and on the scrolls was written God's promise to redeem them, and they would furl and unfurl the scrolls like the string on the wooden reel. The midrash refers to the way in which they would play as yishtashu, and you connect this to a passionate verse from the Book of Psalms, Lulei Torah sha'shuai az avadati be'oni. If Torah had not been my plaything, I would have perished in my affliction. This idea of Torah as a plaything, as a play object, as something that helps us to cope with seeming absence. I think it's a notion that speaks to both of us. Aviva, I know that your engagement with Torah has been lifelong, though it's taken many different forms. And I'm wondering if you can open by speaking a bit to your own personal history with Talmud Torah and your experience of Torah as sha'shua, as plaything.
Well, first of all, Ilana, I'd like to return the compliment and say what a wonderful student you were and are, and how I felt that even when we don't actually see each other in class, I felt that the connection continues, and it gives me a lot of pleasure. Talking of Sha'ashua. Now, if I think about my history with Talmud Torah, the first thing is very much that was what my first exposure was with my father. And for many years, that was really all the Talmud Torah. It was always with him. Starting from age 3, probably, beginning to learn Torah, right? Chumash. Every day we would learn. And it was a great pleasure. And learning meant working through the text with his understandings and his comments, sometimes anecdotes about his life. He was a refugee from Europe in the time of the Nazis. And he had many stories about the old world and the old life and the way that he grew up and the way that he learned. He also learned in a very unconventional way. He was sent away from his hometown where there was no facilities for learning. And he was sent away to live with his grandfather, who was a scholar. And he lived, in a sense, the parents sacrificed his childhood in order that he should be exposed to Torah. And so there was that sense, I think, of Torah filling a large space in his life in every way. And then, of course, living a more normal life later on, teaching, being a rabbi, but always with that sense of a very deep connection, like the deep roots of a tree, with Torah, which he was passing on to me, consciously and unconsciously, through the life stories he told me, and through the love of the words that he conveyed to me. And since that time, the actual words of Torah have had a kind of electric quality for me. They are not indifferent to me. I mean, words in general have a live quality for me. But the words of Torah and the words of midrash, there is something extra there. There's a dynamic that works for me very, very powerfully. So that I studied Torah mostly out of conventional. There wasn't much available anyway. I did study in Gateshead. I took a year that was what was available at that time for a religious young woman who wanted to study Torah more intensively. It was a Haredi kind of place in England. And I must say I was very affected by it. I wasn't rebellious against it. I left that to my sister. She did the rebelling. I did the devotion. I was caught up in it to a great extent. And then I did the rather extreme thing of going straight from Gateshead to Cambridge. Two opposite environments, two very different ways of living. And there the challenge became for me to keep that going internally by learning, in whatever way I could. But basically Torah was the fuel for my attempt to keep another life going in addition to, or perhaps that's not quite the right expression, but energizing my life in the world. And so the learning continued, I would say, after that. And then when I came to Israel, it was almost always learning by myself, with its pluses and minuses. And so Torah had in my life, I think, that urgency that I look for. I think also when I listen to other people, learning Torah, I listen for that urgency of a life need. That this is not just something that is superficially interesting, but it's something that goes deep, and it answers a deep quest, a longing of some kind. And I think the word longing is the best word for what I'm talking about, ga'agua. It's another double word.
Sha'ashua.
And sha'ashua is the paradoxical thing you do when you have very deep longings. And then you can learn to play with things that at first seem so primal that they can't be played with. So I think that's what the child is doing in the Fort Da game. But originally it's not a game. It's very serious. The child hasn't seen his mother for a long time. Freud knew this. His daughter had disappeared from the child's world. And as it turns out, the mother dies. So it's not a frivolous event. And the child is coping with what Jonathan Lear calls a rip in the fabric of life. Jonathan Lear is a contemporary psychoanalyst and philosopher. That's his way of describing what it feels like to endure a traumatic event. You don't know what it is. All you know is that something has been torn. And you're in a lost situation in some way. What enables you to get to the point of being able to call it a loss? Once you're able to call it a loss, you already have it in some way under control. But at first, the feeling is much more profound and undermining. And his answer is, you play. The game, he says, the game of loss leads to the name of loss. Once you have enacted that, throwing the string in and out, and always bringing it back, even though the mother doesn't reappear, you have grown in yourself a certain, he calls it courage, first of all, a sense of motivation, that you're not just lost in the gone part. You don't end with the gone, but you always somehow find a way of thinking beyond it. Call it wishful thinking, whatever you want, bringing it back. And that leads, he says, to the capacity to think. And he says very provocatively, thinking is about absence. Thinking is about absence. So that, we have to think about that. And for me, that has been a very important theme. Longing. Longing is about absence, obviously. But it's a present absence. It's something is not dismissed. That's the last thing you want to do with it. And so the ga'agua is played out in a sha'ashua. Yes, so I'm really kind of throwing the ball back at you now. You gave me sha'ashua, and I'm giving you ga'agua now. And that is having a lot to do with my learning of Torah.
Well, the desire then really becomes part of the game, because you stage that desire and the satisfaction of that desire, but then always the relinquishing and the desire again. And I'm thinking that desire has always been such a prevalent topic in your writing. Your first book, Genesis, the beginning of desire. Right? You were really taken from Wallace Stevens. The idea of what it means to have something that one is longing for. Over the course of your career, beginning with that book about Genesis, you then went on to write a book about Exodus. You wrote a book about the wilderness, about the Book of Numbers. You've written a biography of Moshe, which is essentially a book about Deuteronomy. And yet you said you always shied away from writing about Leviticus. In fact, I think you told me you dreaded writing about Leviticus. Ironically, it's interesting because the transition from Exodus to the Book of Leviticus describes a situation, though the Ramban talks a lot about this, about Moshe being excluded from Ohel Moed, from the tabernacle, which he has supervised the construction of, right? The entire tabernacle is filled, saturated with the cloud of God's presence. And Moshe's outside, sort of not uncertain about his way in. And then God calls him, Vayikra el Moshe, the opening words of the book. And I'm wondering, do you identify with Moshe at this moment? What called you in to the book of Leviticus? How did you find your entry into this book that you always dreaded learning about?
The word dreaded doesn't sound quite right to me. So I may have used it, but I think what I mostly felt was just that I wasn't going to write about it. I didn't feel doomed to write about it in any way. I felt free to decide what I wanted to write about. No one has bound me to a contract. And I assumed I wouldn't be writing about it. I want to put it like that. It's even more radical. No, that's not for me. Why not for me? Because it's all about ritual and sacrifice and details, legal details, technical details, if you will. And there are two stories in the book. It's true. There are two narratives, but that's not what the book's about. The book is about something else. And that made it pretty clear to me that I wasn't going to be writing about it, because I thrive on narrative. That's for many reasons. Law is not my focus at all. But I began to feel called, as you put it so beautifully, mostly because, first of all, because I began to look more closely at the midrash on the word Vayikra. Even Midrash Rabbah, the Ptichta, the opening section, is all about the word Vayikra, not about sacrifices or rituals. It's about the implications of the word calling. That God, what does it mean? Why did God have to call to Moses, as if Moses is somewhere else? Yeah, so already that suggests absence and distance and needing to bridge the distance. But a whole introduction in the midrash just on the one word and the various inflections of the word. And that made it clear to me that you could write about Vayikra, about this book, that it's not all about the laws, that actually the laws and the technical functioning of the Mishkan, which is extremely important, holds like around it a kind of nimbus or, penumbra, like you have around a darkened area of the moon, let's say. There's a less dark part that belongs to the legal part, and that if you're not aware of it, you're missing a great deal from the legal part too. So my ambition has not been to integrate the two things, although perhaps it happens occasionally, but really just to talk about that nimbus, to talk about that, and the very rich material that emerged from that. Should I talk now about the golden calf?
Well, I was just going to say, even that opening term, Vayikra, connotes so much desire, right? If
that's right. It's taken as that, yes.
It's taken on, I don't know if you want to speak a little about that desire on the part of God for Moshe.
For Moses, yes, from Moshe. That's what comes out in that Petichta, the opening of the midrash, is the special love God has for Moshe. He calls him with a kind of, it's called chiba, chavivut, which is not passion, it's a familiarity. I know you, you know me. We talk to one another as a ki'ish el re'ehu, as one talks to one's friend. Now that sounds, in a way, impossible, right? Surely that's a hyperbole. You can't talk to God as you would to a friend. God is not your friend. God is terror, as well as everything. And Moshe knows that. He's had experiences. And yet, in a way, the essential experience, from God's point of view, viewed by the sages, of course, this is through a human lens, is the extraordinary tenderness of the relationship, the mutual relationship between God and Moshe, and the privilege that God gives Moshe to speak to him at any time. Whenever Moshe turns up, God will turn away from his work like a king who turns aside from his important affairs of state, basically just because he loves the way his friend speaks. He loves to listen to his friend, not so much the content, perhaps, as, when you really love someone, you just get real pleasure from watching them and listening to them speak. There's something about the way Moshe speaks, with all his speech defect, that really God enjoys. I want to put it like that. And that offers hope in a way, for all the stammerers among us who feel they're not good speakers, that it could be that there is a way in which when they do speak, it is lovable. It's lovable to God, it's lovable to what the world needs. So somewhere that I took a personal interest in that.
There's a tenderness, and there's also a certain calling, demand of Moshe. You have a task to fulfill, right? You need to come in and do this. Don't, enough with your humility. That's true, right? As well. Feigned humility.
That is true. Yes, God in a way reproaches Moshe for being so, shy, standing aside. At the same time, God appreciates it. In other words, it is important. That sense of deference is important. not to go overboard with the effusive love. But on the other hand, as you're saying, God does seem to, in a way, criticize Moshe for being too deferential, and Moshe hears what God says. And it seems to me that he takes advantage of that when he really speaks very aggressively to God after the golden calf. And he understands somewhere that we are intimate enough for this to be possible, to say what I really feel. I don't have to be so polite. So he takes courage from God's encouragement to defend the people in a rather cavalier, tearing the marriage contract in the midrash, smashing the tablets. All that is, in a way, very undeferential behavior. Obviously, it's violent behavior, but it's a violence that has to do with intimacy.
You mentioned the golden calf, which is, of course, much of the subject of this book. It's interesting, when you pick up your book, there are 3 epigraphs to the book, and one of them is, none of them are from the Book of Leviticus. One is actually from the Book of Exodus about the commandment to build the Mishkan. And I'm wondering, to what extent was your entry, your calling into this book? Also, how did Exodus invite you into Leviticus? How did the golden calf provide an entry point for you into this book?
That is the moment really that I'm most grateful for in this whole process, was when it suddenly clarified itself to me that, like a kind of revelation, if you want to call it that this book is all about the golden calf. It's about the aftermath that follow the golden calf. In other words, the word I use a lot is that the book is haunted by the episode of the golden calf, which seems narratively to have been concluded in the book of Exodus. There is a number of people die in punishment. There are repercussions, and then there's forgiveness. And it seems that by the time we get into the book of Leviticus, of Vayikra, that's behind us. And the midrash takes pains to detect those haunting moments and sees them as central to the dynamics, the human dynamics around the Mishkan. What happens, that the whole Mishkan is an attempt really to expiate, and the functioning of the Mishkan, not just the building of it, but the functioning of the Mishkan, the sin offering, the guilt offering. The people can't shake off a certain sense of shame and fear. And the people, including Aaron, who strangely collaborated with the making of the golden calf. It's unclear exactly how much he is to be criticized for that, but he feels very guilty, according to the midrash. And there are many extraordinary midrashic references to the spiritual and psychological dynamics of the people involved, Aaron, the Israelites, the people involved in the processes of the midrash, of the Mishkan's functioning. What, especially in the first stages, where God's presence is being invited to enter. God says, "I will live among." If they make me a holy place, I will live among them. V'shachanti b'tochem. That's from Exodus, as you said. When it comes to it, that is not so simple at all. And the process of its complexity is spelled out in the book of Leviticus, where God doesn't immediately come and live, right? It takes 7 days of preparation, and then on the 8th day, there are delays, and there is a lot of suspense and anguish, because everyone realizes this is not just God absenting himself when we want him, but it's a way, it's also saying to us that we haven't been forgiven, that there hasn't really been atonement. And so that is one example, and it's a very big one in the midrash, of how the underlying narrative of Vayikra has a lot to do with the golden calf and with the shame of Aaron. Perhaps I'll say a little more about that later.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit, because I think a lot of your entry into the Chumashim that you've written about has been through the human drama very often. And the book of Leviticus is a book that's largely about questions of holiness and purity, and yet you do such a masterful job of drawing out the human drama, specifically with Moshe and Aharon, in terms of how their different relationships or the different roles they played in the episode of the golden calf affects their role, their attitude towards the Mishkan and towards the question of whether God's presence will dwell in the Mishkan, when God's presence will dwell in the Mishkan, the anxieties each of them experience. I'm wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit to that human dimension that you explore in the book of the connection between the different relationships of Moshe and Aaron to the Mishkan on account of their histories.
Yes, that's an excellent question. Aaron, I think he is in the foreground in the midrashic narrative.
Mm-hmm.
He is the one who is required to krav. Early in Parshat Tzav, Moshe tells Aaron, krav el hamizbeach, which has a technical meaning. Means come close, means to offer sacrifices. Be ready to offer korbanot, right? Acts of closeness. A korban is an act of intimacy of some kind. But the midrash takes it as meaning through mishalim, parables, the parable of a shy bride. She marries the king, and he mitbayeshet, and she is shy of coming close to him. Right? Everyone understands what that means. And her sister, her braver sister, who doesn't have to do it, tells her, "Gayeset datech, gayesiet datech," meaning steel yourself, mobilize yourself, get over all this tender, sensitive flower thing.
And coarsen yourself.
Coarsen yourself. Gas, exactly. It's a military, legayes, giyus, gas. Coarsen yourself, make yourself masculine. It's a wonderful, fusion of opposites here. In order to fulfill your role, you know why you married. This is so the sister.
The Gemara even says, right? Everyone knows the reason a bride goes under the canopy, right?
That's right. Not in this context, but yeah. But it's really it's a horror in a way. I think of it from the point of view of the bride now. And for the bride, that's not exactly helpful. It is and it isn't, because that's not where she is at the moment. She is overwhelmed by this. And her helpful sister, who turns out to be in reality the brother, right? Aaron's brother is Moshe, who's encouraging him, krav. And krav comes to mean then not so much get close as overcome impediments to getting close, which has very large meanings then. It means, of course, there are impediments, and maybe there should be impediments. Of course, there's shame. There's an acknowledgement of shame. How could you be a worthwhile human being without that sense of horizons, of failures, of inadequacies? But get over it. Your job is in some way to live with it, to live well with it. The golden calf happened. And the radical truth about it is, as the Talmud says, back in the book of Exodus already, that is something of the golden calf, the trauma, the disorder that is the golden calf, will remain throughout the generations. It will never be eliminated. Evil does not get eliminated. I think I would carry it a step further. That there is here a kind of basically tragic view of reality. This will remain, and in each generation, I will demand an unki. It's like a little, Aramaic word. It means an ounce, a smithering, whatever the word is, of punishment for the golden calf. I won't punish you all at one fell swoop now and destroy you, but you'll feel it.
Right, and the golden calf was ground into smithereens. That's a very apt image.
That's right. Yes, exactly. So I read that to apply not only to the punishment. That is, it's saying the golden calf issue, whatever it was about, and we haven't really spoken about that will remain throughout the generations. There's no getting rid of it. But you have to learn to live well with it. That's what it means, krav, to try to overcome that distance that is created by the golden calf without getting rid of it. You just live well with it. That's another of Jonathan Lear's felicitous expressions. To live well with certain issues that are part of human nature. So that's as far as Aaron's concerned. If I could just add something about Moshe, since you asked. Moshe, in the very challenging reading of the Meshech Chochmah, a 19th century commentary, Moshe himself was idolized by the people from the beginning of the story onwards. He became a kind of idol, and they somehow, in a culture of idolatry in which they were reared, they came to regard him as the latest idol. He was a new version of an old story. And that's why they refer to him as Ze Moshe Ha'ish Asher He'elanu Me'eretz Mitzrayim. This man, Moshe, who brought us up from the land of Egypt. The Meshech Chochmah reads that very literally. They think he was the one, and God is a kind of, background haze. They don't really relate to that.
And lo yadanu mehayalo. We don't know what happened to him. We can't handle his absence.
Yes,
we can't handle that he's not here.
Exactly.
An idol doesn't disappear.
Yeah. And when the fetish disappoints you, if every child who's ever worshipped a doll or whatever, this has been everything, and the fetish disappoints, doesn't come through, then there's a tremendous violence against him. So there is violence against Moshe. Moshe realizes that he was the idol who failed. And nevertheless, he overcomes that and pleads for the people. He doesn't allow that to, but there is this uneasy feeling that it's he then who is in some way responsible for it. So it doesn't allow him to be completely self-righteous about, and that also appears somewhere at moments in the text.
So I think we're beginning to get at what was the sin of the golden calf about, certainly in the midrashic imagination, which is your subject. And you speak about that in the book. You often quote from a philosopher, Eric Zantner, in terms of Egyptomania. I'm wondering if you can speak a little to what is Egyptomania? How does it characterize the sin of the calf? And how is it about more than just the calf itself and really some of the larger issues you've been getting at?
Okay. I understand Egyptomania. But let me say, first of all, what Zantner says. Zantner says there are various forms of Egyptomania which the people have to leave. That leaving Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim, emerging from Egypt, is really not emerging from the land, in as far as we're talking about now a psychoanalytic condition that people suffer from. We suffer from Egyptomania, he calls it. What is Egypt for him? It's the various forms of constriction. Mitzar, Mitzarim, Mitzrayim. I don't know if he knows that classic pun, but it certainly works very well. That the word for Egypt can be punned on the word for a constraint, a strait, anguish, things that limit one's development as a human being, able to live in the world, able to encounter the midst of life, as he likes to say. And these habits of the mind and the soul have to do with repetition compulsions. You just keep doing the same thing, even though it's not helpful. Have to do with defenses of all kinds. I don't want to recognize my own reality, what I'm really doing, and therefore it goes wild. And overcoming that would mean a certain kind of self-knowledge, a certain kind of insight, and a willingness to negotiate with the calf, which appears beautifully in a midrash about Aaron, who is said to, when he's shy about approaching the altar, he sees the altar in the form of a calf, which is an inspired hallucination. Yeah, he sees the horns of the altar, as they're actually called.
Not to mention that the first sacrifice is an egel, I believe, right? Like if we needed any more
egel. That's right, the sin offering, which in a sense is what the whole structure is about. It's to deal with the sin of the golden calf. That's the main purpose in its larger implications. And so when Aaron sees the altar looking like a calf, that really intimidates him. What? Right here in the heart of things? That shows that God hasn't forgotten, and that this is really what we're still faced with. And God basically, and Moshe, through as the intermediary, he says, yes, get close to that.
Mm-hmm.
You have to learn to negotiate with that.
Yeah, I think though, as you draw it on the book, Egyptomania, it's about idolatry. It's about a need for the thingness of something and the presence. But it's immediacy also in the sense of time, that Egyptomania is not just about space, but also about a certain mania in time. Can you speak to a little bit about that as it relates to the golden calf?
Yes, the first word that's used in the chapter about the golden calf, chapter 32 of Exodus, is the people saw that Moshe was boshesh, that he was slow in coming down the mountain, that he was late. It's a really odd word suddenly to appear in the Torah, boshesh. He was hanging, he wasn't back when expected. They look at their watches and,
right, bashesh, where is he?
Where is he? Bashesh, that's the pun. That's the pun that you have in Rashi, in the midrash. Play with the word boshesh as bashesh. The 6th hour of the day has come. He said he'd be back by this time, and he's not back. I won't go into all the details of it. And they hold him to his time frame by the moment. He's not 40 days late. Right? This midrash undermines that 40-day buffer, which allows us to say self-righteously, what, only 40 days? That's what we usually say. That's all it took to have the people forget the revelation. But the midrash makes it worse and narrows it down to just be, right? We expected it now. And that's enough to destroy Moshe, this man who was our total, and make it happen now. So making it happen now, it's a kind of impatience, but impatience sounds like a trivial fault, and I don't think every form of impatience is a terrible thing. But there is a sense of a kind of compulsive need to make things real at the time that you want them, that you think it should happen, without any ease of allowing things to happen. That there are processes. If you're dealing with an organism, if you're dealing with something alive, then it has its own timing. It has its own sense of timing. Whereas their preference at certain crucial moments is to ignore that larger sense of timing and under internal pressure to make it happen now, which can sometimes be the best way of destroying a process.
Even the process of tuman tahara, of moving from impurity to purity, also involves time, right?
Yes.
There are certain things that no matter how many sacrifices you bring, uva shemesh v'taher, right? You have to wait for the sunset, for the purity to come. Time has to happen. There's a waiting that is necessary in every process of healing and of purifying and recovering.
Yes, I think so, very much. Yes.
Yeah, I'm interested because I think it is very much a theme throughout your book, the idea of needing to wait, of not hastening something, of being able to sit with that sort of low fire anxiety. And it also underlies the two you mentioned before. There are two narratives in the Book of Leviticus. One about Nadav and Avihu, and one about the blasphemer, both of which you write about at length. I'm wondering if you can speak about both of those narratives, as sort of expanding upon this theme of Egyptomania in time, of an inability to wait and to sit with that uncertainty, to simply be.
Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, are burned by fire at the very climax, when the presence of God does in fact appear in the form of fire. A fire comes forth from God and consumes the sacrifices, and that is the long, devoutly waited for moment when God makes his appearance, but symbolically speaking. But in that very same moment, or just before it, or just after it, it's not so clear. Most people say after it. A fire consumes Nadav and Avihu as well. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about this. I discovered a reading by the Rashbam, who is the arch pshat reader, the reader who really, he's the grandson of Rashi, and he really tries to read without the aid of midrash, and somewhere just the text as it in itself. And he says, it's really an unusual reading. He says the same fire, first of all. A fire came forth from God, and on its way to consume the sacrifices, it found Nadav and Avihu, who had precipitately, they had tried to get in quickly and make the fire happen. So there's a kind of tragic coincidence, just as Nadav and Avihu had decided, enough of this waiting. The fire is not happening. That means we are still guilty of the golden calf, and they can't bear that complicated situation that is enduring now endlessly, it feels, that they decide to bring fire from their own fireplaces.
And ironically, that inability to wait is the building of the calf, right? It's replicating the building of the calf.
It's actually replicating it. And they lay great emphasis for them, what's very important, just provide fire shine. You don't have to be so fussy about it. It'll come from God. What needs to happen is that things get moving. Now, that temperament, which I think is rather, it's rather fashionable these days. To get in there and do it, make it happen.
Be proactive, yes.
In all kinds of ways. You think you're going to achieve anything by sitting back and waiting? Yeah. I think this is a kind of corrective, this story, because what it says is that Nadav and Avihu, the word I'd like to use is a word that was coined by a contemporary psychoanalyst, Christopher Bollas. He makes up the word normotic, which I really like. We've heard of neurotic and psychotic and so on. He says there is such a thing as holding as a fetish the normal. The way things normally have to happen, the normal and the natural, and that's what we want to happen. And therefore you need fire, go home and bring fire. Now that kind of adoration of the normal becomes a very serious limitation. It means you can't dream. It means that subjectivity has no place in your life. Everything has to be sensible and out there and regulated. And they're trying to do that. They regard that as the priest's function. In fact, there's certain truth to that. The priest is there to fulfill functions of various kinds. But they don't have any sense of the mystery of the movement of the organism, of the movement of what happens when there is an other involved who has his own sense of timing. Keats, the poet Keats, famously talked about the need that the artist has for a kind of diligent indolence. And he says that what that means is to be able to bear uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without irritably reaching after reason and fact. I think the most important word there is irritably. Reason and fact are good things, no doubt. But mysteries and doubts and uncertainties, right? Irritation won't get you very far with that.
Yeah, and it's also to be able to handle Moshe disappearing into that cloud on the mountain and not being back necessarily right when you think. And right, the midrash says, the people couldn't handle it at all. They were already sitting with the calf, already beginning to plan the egel, right? After one day, says the midrash very radically, right? I think it starts with 40 and then they work it down, right? Already only one day they couldn't handle. And this analogy of the bride who is sinning under her own, who's committing adultery under her own wedding canopy, this total inability to be able to wait and to endure uncertainty, absence, mystery, cloud, a voice coming from heaven like you've never heard before. That inability to live with that is very much also the sin of Nadav and Avihu as you map one onto the other.
Exactly. Yes, that's very, very important. I think very valuable. To be the flower and not the bee. That's the Keats again. I think he just says it in a word. We tend to overvalue the bee. The bee is the one that does the pollination. There is such a thing as attentive waiting, attentive listening.
And a blossoming in its own time.
Yes.
Yeah. And then the other narrative in Leviticus also, in Parshat Emor, the narrative of the person who curses God, I think you also read that as the story of being unable to wait, being unable to tolerate something in life. Can you speak to that?
That's a very radical and tragic story. I think I find it a little difficult to talk about it in brief, but let me try. The way the midrash, again, thinks about this character who suddenly comes out into the camp and fights with an Israelite and curses the name, it's completely mysterious. Moshe doesn't know what to think about it. He can't diagnose it. He can't legislate. So he passes it on to God. And God says, the death penalty. What the midrash does is give us a whole human background. It's very elaborate. It goes back to a woman among the Israelites in the time of slavery who is desired by an Egyptian taskmaster, who takes advantage of an opportunity when takes the husband away from home and comes and has relations with her. She doesn't know that it's not her husband. And then a child is born, and that child becomes the Mekalel. What a story. That is blowing the mind, There's
what a backstory to invent for an otherwise anonymous character.
This is someone who has no place in the camp. That's the clearest way that the commentaries talk about it. And the case comes to court, to Moshe's court, and Moshe rules against him. Why is there no place? And then he comes out and blasphemes. That's the reason for his blasphemy. And I want to say something about blasphemy, but first, in terms of the narrative, it means this is someone who has no place anywhere. He is not an Egyptian because his mother is an Israelite. That is halachically. He is an Israelite, but there's still no place for him in the world. And that suddenly becomes a kind of rocket head, for all such situations in the world, where people can't find themselves in the world. They may even have some halachic basis for being accepted, and yet they're not accepted. Right? And I think there are a whole large problems that are based on this kind of understanding, and there are individual problems. In any case, he is an extreme example of this. What is cursing? Cursing is hating. One of the things I do in the chapter is to show how the verbal expression of hatred is the curse, and the physical expression of hatred is a blow, to kill someone or to. So he's expressing his hatred. He's expressing hatred of what? Of the Shem Hashem, of everything God is in the world. Right? Not who God is transcendently is not the issue. That is the culture of God, the culture of the Israelites, which has banned him. The Shem HaMefurash that he heard at Har Sinai. He heard the name that was revealed at Har Sinai, and he hates it. That is, he's hostile to it because it has condemned him. And the feeling I have is that for the reader, this poses a special problem. For the modern reader, let's say, it's very hard to read this situation without some sympathy for the Mekalel. And one can find hints of it in midrashic material, even at a time that was much less sympathetic to disorder than we are now. Traumatic disorder. For instance, a very famous midrash in which God says the power of the law is all against this man, and the law is God's law. We're talking about halacha, is all against this man, but I feel for the tears of the miserable, for the tears of the suffering. And in some way, God aligns himself with, emotionally with. So I tend to feel that this is an example of an unbearable story for the reader. We are made to feel very uncomfortable. On the one hand, on the other hand, we're on both sides. And in such situations, it seems to me that just as we said, one shouldn't rush to judgment. it's not necessary to come down heavily on one or other side of the issue as a reader, that maybe you're meant to suffer as a reader sometimes. A reader doesn't always have to come out, chad v'chalak, I understand perfectly now the rights and wrongs of this. I think there's, again, a tendency to thinking that if you're reading well, then you, in some way, you come out with a theologically sane and workable solution. I think sometimes, what did Kafka say in one of his letters? He says, why would one read a story that does not wound or stab one? As he say, an axe for the frozen sea inside us. Right? That is what a good story is. It comes and it breaks up our apathy. It breaks up our indifference, and it allows us to really to live with the tensions. And it's very easy to talk about that. I know people like talking about living with tensions. Tension has become a very good word. But, if you've ever been in tension, it's not an easy thing to live with. And the idea would be you're faced with a certain narrative in the Torah, and it's not the only one, perhaps, in which it makes your skin prickle. That's the midrashic pun on Yitro telling a story to Moshe that makes Moshe telling a story to Yitro, his father-in-law, that makes Yitro's flesh prickle. Vayichad Yitro. Chidudin.
Because Yitro, like this Mekalel, like the blasphemer, and like Moshe, is someone who has divided loyalties and sort of a mixed background in a way, right?
Yes. I'm not so sure if it's so much divided loyalties. I mean, no one is more unequivocal than Moshe in his Ish Moshe.
Right.
But
a complicated background.
Complicated, yeah. But it's really more Yitro and others. He's not the only one. You don't have to be a real outsider to feel like an outsider. And I think the reader of Torah is being sensitized to these complicated sensibility, put it like that, which you have to learn how to deal with.
Yeah, I think a lot of what the midrash tries to do, or effectively does, I don't know, trying, but is to instill in us a sense of compassion for what might otherwise be, certainly in this case, a rather unsympathetic character, which is interesting because so much of the charge of the holiness code in the Book of Leviticus is to learn to cultivate that compassion within us, right? That's really at the heart of Parshat Kedoshim,
yes,
right?
Yes,
and really, Parshat Kedoshim at once it's these very, very specific laws of how we are to treat those who are, might otherwise be unsympathetic figures, how we're to have compassion for them. But also there's this sort of aspirational call to be holy, right? So there's the specific and this general, almost impossible task. I'm wondering if you can speak a little to what is the idea of holiness that lies at the heart of this book, and how does it relate to those specific charges?
I think holiness has to do with aspiration. I'm thinking of the famous Ramban passage in the Ramban, where he says it has to do with lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond the strict line of what's required in the law. So that tendency to go beyond doesn't necessarily mean Puritanism. I think I for many years I read it as kind of a desire to be holier than thou in some way, because it has to do with sexual things. Otherwise, says Ramban, you can become a naval b'rshut Torah, which means a sensualist by Torah license. Right? You could not be overstepping any official line, and yet clearly that's not the way the Torah meant you to live, even with your own wife, even with your right now. The idea somewhere of an aspiration towards something that one doesn't fully know yet oneself. I find the idea of aspiration very powerful. I've come across it in many of the sources that I like to think about. And having to do with an area that you can't just immediately hold on to. So again, it's not that impatience. Oh, I'm going to keep 6 hours instead of 3 hours between meals. That's an aspiration. Aspiration has about it something more delicate. I know there is something further that God wants of me, but I don't yet know exactly what it is. So I kind of listen for intimations in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Where could I be more in tune? Yeah. And that would be, in a way, just the opposite of the grabbing at the solution right away. You know, the golden calf.
Egyptomania, yes.
Yes, yeah, the Egypt. It would be a way of being a little hesitant, in a way, almost, and feeling. Things are coming towards you. You can feel them out.
That's very beautiful, the language of aspiration, because of course it also connotes the breath, right? The aspiring, and the aspiration to be holy is to be like the part of God that is breathed inside us when human beings are created, right? When Adam Harishon is created, it's the breath breathed into Adam. So we aspire to that part of us.
Yes, the breathing is very much part of it.
Yeah,
yes.
Shi'ifa, a longing, an aspiring. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You just mentioned the idea of intimation, of not necessarily having the whole of the thing there, but maybe having the shadows of it or the traces of it. And I wanted to try to conclude with this question of, I think a lot of the power of your Torah, Aviva, lies in those intimations, that you don't draw moral lessons from the Torah for living explicitly, right? There's never anything didactic about, or your teaching is not overly didactic in that sense, which is in a way in which you're a little different from the halachic tradition that emerges out of the same midrashic tradition that you write about. And I think that's a lot of the power of your Torah is what you're able to do with intimation, with those suggestions. And I'm curious, you call this book The Hidden Order of Intimacy. I'm wondering if you could speak perhaps to the relationship between intimation and intimacy, what it means to hint at something and what it means to be close to something.
Hinting is very important in my way of thinking and sensibility. And it's very important in the midrash. Midrash often talks about, even in the Mishkan, that how do the artisans know exactly what to do? And the understanding is that they know what the objects in the Mishkan are hinting towards, that they stand symbolically for things. And they are the artisans, the artists, I regard them as artists actually, who know how to inform, to create something that will intimate, what. And that's extreme intimacy. An artist knows what's inside the material. He's right in there. The classic artist is the one who works with clay, he doesn't just apply material, but he's got his hands in there. And that's intimate. That's a way of feeling where is it going and knowing where I want it to go. It's a conversation. It's going somewhere, and that I find life is in that. I actually I'm quite averse to the opposite. I'm quite averse to the didactic. Maybe because I have something didactic in myself. And maybe I was more that way once upon a time. And I fight it on some level because I don't think that's the way life gets produced. Life's when the touch is gentle, not I don't know if there's anything else I can say about it.
Well, you remind me of the very powerful midrash about Bezalel. How did Bezalel know exactly how to build the Mishkan?
Yes.
And Moshe says to him, maybe you were in the shadow of God.
Yes,
the idea being, right?
Really lovely.
Maybe you had that intimation and that intimacy with God. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe
to be in the shadow of God.
To be
Shadows are like that.
Yeah. And I think,
shadows intimate reality. If there's a shadow, there's something there. But maybe all you'll see is the shadow.
And that's what you opened with, the midrashic penumbra that really drew you into this book. So thank you.
I feel we are really, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aviva.
This has been very, very gratifying.
Thank you. Thank you. Such an honor. Thank you.